welcome back to another video. So I wanted to talk about today the infamous Skypiea arc and why I kind of have mixed feelings on the arc in its entirety. Now I do feel like out of all of the One Piece arcs that there are, this one probably has some of the most mixed reviews and opinions on it based off what I've seen One Piece fans saying either they like it or they find it dreadfully boring and doesn't need to be in the story. Now, I do want to mention this early on. Obviously, it was a little bit more important than a lot of people thought all those years ago, or whether you're watching it now or whenever. But obviously, now in the story, in the manga and everything like that, it's a lot more important. I'm not going to go into why, I just know that it's a lot more important. I mean, I don't really know why, but I was told that by my brother who's actively watching One Piece and is basically wherever it is right now. And the reason that it got brought up was because I was actually texting him, this was about a week ago, maybe a week and a half ago, something like that, and I was like, hey, this arc is really, really slow paced. And he was like, it gets better. I was like, I'm not really enjoying it too much. And he was like, it gets better, but it's super important at this moment. So hopefully that kind of clears up why I know that. Now, jumping into my review of Skypiea, I enjoyed it more at the end versus the story buildup it actually did have. So it basically starts up with them entering Heaven's Gate, and then they don't actually have the funds to get in, so they get in there, and then the lady's like, hey, we have some intruders and blah blah blah. So we get up there and they do meet a girl named Conus and her father, and they kind of explain a little bit about the island, and then they meet the kind of police there, the lower level police there. And I thought this was kind of enjoyable in itself, the witty humor that you have basically when they're kind of on the beach and they're talking to them, and everything they do basically is a crime essentially. When they're sleeping, they're snoring, that raises their crime level. Everything they do is just raising their crime level. It's that's very, very silly, and it was just an enjoyable kind of humor at that moment. Now, fast forward a little bit, you do have Nami actually getting the waiver, and then she ends up taking it out a little bit too far, and she ends up at the upper yard, where she kind of comes across some people saying, hey, there's some intruders here, and then she's like, oh crap, that's us. So she rushes back and to tell everybody, essentially. And now this is where the story does actually begin, and basically they kind of get separated because Conus kind of betrays them, which we find out a little bit later, and then we find out, the full mighty force of Lord Eneru, or God Eneru, Enel, whatever you want to refer to him as, when he actually rains down lightning on the land, and then they get a good idea of what they're dealing with. Now again, at this point you do have the Straw Hats split up. Conus helps them actually get a boat after admitting to them that she actually did sabotage them and try to get them to directly go to the upper yard for their execution, essentially. And so they make their way there. They end up meeting one of the the higher priestess named Satori, who basically just has the mystery ball attack. That's what I'm calling it, essentially, where basically all of these little floating balls have either something very dangerous, like an explosive, or something not so dangerous, like a flower. Personally, I do feel like the pacing in this fight was very, very slow and very drawn out. More drawn out than it needed to be, given they weren't even realistically that powerful. Literally, it could take one really, really good punch from Luffy, and this person would be out. Because realistically, I do feel like in that fight, Sanji could have taken him alone, or even Usopp, to be honest. Now, eventually, you do actually see the altar where the Going Merry does end up, and you do have Chopper and Gonfall basically kind of doing their first battle, essentially. They're gone for a little bit, and then they end up back at the altar, and this is where everybody kind of meets up with each other. Now, after they hang out for a little bit and have a fire, and they eat and dance with some wolves, and it was actually a pretty funny moment, to be honest, they do actually go into the forest, and the plan basically was for some of them to split up to go and do a different task. However, I do feel like they were just together, and then they all split up again, especially when the snake was introduced, the giant serpent was introduced, and they started fighting it, only to actually separate the group even more, and Robin was the only one actually on track. So now everybody is everywhere, essentially, and it just felt like it was going to draw out the story a lot more than it needed to. At this point, you do see a lot more combat, where you do have Zoro facing one of the Shandorians, and then you do have Luffy encountering Wiper again at this point, and their fight was kind of cool, to be honest, because it was Wiper, essentially, he just didn't like anybody, essentially. It was just kind of funny, to be honest, how much utter disdain he had for the Blue Sea Dwellers. And that's honestly why I kind of liked his character, but after a while it did kind of get a little bit annoying because, he just wasn't invincible, essentially, until obviously at the end, essentially. But obviously the snake does interrupt by eating Luffy, and this is where I actually have another issue, where Luffy being in the snake's belly lasted so much longer than it needed to be. Like, so much longer. And it bothered me so much how much time was wasted with Luffy actually being in the snake and not even knowing where he was. Like, it was so dumb to me. I'm sorry, but it was just so silly to have him in the snake's stomach so long. It was funny when he was just kind of beating the snake up from inside trying to escape, but outside of that, it just felt really, really unnecessary to have him in there for so long. Now, something I really wanted to discuss really quick was the fact that Skypiea basically revolves solely around, like, faith in a god, essentially, whether he's a false god or whatever. It revolves around faith, and I do feel like it does do a good job at actually touching that up. And what I mean by that is they discuss multiple different points of views. People who don't believe that, you know, this person is their god. People who don't believe in God at all, like Zoro. He basically, you know, is an atheist in the show. I don't know if he exactly is, but he basically expresses his opinion saying he doesn't believe in God. And then they also have the hardcore believers like the Skypeans, and then people like Konis who can be kind of wavered easily, essentially, where she's like, hey, I don't believe that he is my God, but she does believe in God, essentially. So I do feel like they do a good job at actually discussing multiple points of views of faith, so I do like that. And I'm not even a super religious person. I just like their viewpoint and basically, I guess, Oda's writing on that. We do eventually learn that Eneru basically wants to destroy all of Skypiea because he feels like it's unnatural to actually have people living in the sky. I feel like that was a little contradictory given he is a person that lives in the sky. He's not an actual god, he's a false god, essentially, he's someone who's super powerful and basically views himself as God because who's gonna stop him, essentially. Now, one moment in the show that I did like was the fact that you did have Eneru basically saying, hey, this is how many people are gonna be left, and there were 5 people left, essentially. Now, the 4 standing in front of him were Wiper, Gonfold, as well as Zoro and Nico Robin. And basically he was like, you guys can come with me, you guys can be my next priestesses, essentially, be my next warriors, and they all say no. Now, I did actually like this moment because you actually did have all of them attacking him, and obviously he disposed of most of them pretty easily until Wiper did actually get a really, really good blow on him, actually killing him at one point, but he was actually able to revive himself, which I didn't exactly see that one coming, but it makes sense because obviously Luffy was the one to destroy him in the end or beat him in the end. But I felt like that was a pretty cool moment to see Wiper actually get his moment of actually kind of like destroying this false god for a good moment. One thing that did bother me about Wiper was, yes, he was a strong warrior, but I don't understand how that man is still alive. He used that exploding dial so many times, and then he was also shocked by Eneru, like with a ton of volts of electricity, and he still wasn't dead. Like, I understand being tough, but at the end of the day, he's human, okay? He's not Zoro, who's just like, we're not even going to talk about Zoro, but essentially, it didn't make sense. I honestly would have enjoyed a storyline where Wiper did actually die, because it didn't make sense that he was still alive given how much he actually went through. Now, fast forwarding, you do actually have Luffy eventually getting out of the snake, which was really, really nice to see. I was like, finally, Luffy is entering the battle. And you do have the little girl Aiza with him basically saying, hey, I can take you to him. So they end up meeting eventually, and it was a pretty cool, like, prequel fight essentially to the big moment later on. However, I will say that Eneru's downfall was essentially very predictable. I didn't like that fact because he was essentially pretty nerfed with the fact that he couldn't use one of his strongest abilities. But obviously they show you a little bit later that he's still no pushover because just basically physically with his staff, he was still doing a good amount of damage to Luffy because he was predicting his attacks on top of that. But even in the fight, Luffy was obviously getting the upper hand constantly until he actually put that golden ball on his hand, which was obviously ultimately his defeat in the end, so that was counterproductive on his part, but obviously he couldn't have known that. So he throws Luffy to the bottom essentially, and Luffy keeps running up this stalk trying to attack him, and eventually he does use his Raigo, which is basically just a giant ball of electricity that he's going to rain down on the people, and he gave us basically a small example of this, which it's super powerful, but eventually Luffy does get up there, he jumps into his next big, huge Raigo, and he just dispels it. Like, it wasn't even an effort for Luffy. He was just swinging around his hand, and I mean, that's a lot of electricity he's taken on, but it wasn't really affecting me, essentially. But he's just swinging it around, and I didn't like the fact that it was so easy for Luffy to just kind of get through one of his strongest attacks. I felt like there should have been some kind of struggle outside of the buildup of him trying to get up there and constantly getting knocked down by Eneru. Outside of that, though, there was no real struggle, because after that, he dispelled it, and then he went on to attack Eneru. I will say, the Wiper's redeemable moment for me, because he was likable, but he wasn't crazy likable. His redeemable moment was when he was finally kind of coming around, and he rang the bell, after we got that amazing flashback about Nolan, which I do feel like the flashback with Nolan was placed a little weird, because they almost put, like, all the action on pause to tell that story, but I guess it was there to build up the fact that Luffy was inevitably going to ring that bell, because he wanted everybody to know that, you know, the City of Gold was in the sky the entire time. And that was a heartfelt moment. I absolutely enjoyed the moment, and it was definitely a saving grace moment kind of for me. It saved the arc for me, because it was so... It was well told, the flashback, and it was like, oh my, you know, it almost got a tear to my eye and everything. It was just a very heartfelt moment, but the build-up necessary to that was just so dreadful to me. It was so much storytelling that I don't feel like needed to be. I feel like they could have cut that in half, essentially. Now, taking a step back a little bit of something I wanted to discuss that I felt like was really, really silly was Kona's going back to actually warn the Skypieans about Eneru wanting to destroy all of their land and all of their homes, essentially, was the fact that she had such a tough time actually convincing them, until she did actually yell that she didn't recognize Eneru as her god, and he didn't do anything, and then all of a sudden they just changed their minds. I felt like that was really dumb how that was. Like, I get it, because they were like, okay, nothing happened, so is he actually real? But for people who actually were heavy in their faith and really, really believed in him, just to switch so quickly in their faith, I don't know. I didn't like that, essentially. I felt like it should have taken a lot more convincing. For me, I feel like they should have actually seen some of the destruction and basically felt the destruction and had it happen to them firsthand to fully believe that it was actually going to happen to them, and then maybe seeing some rescue attempts by Luffy and the Straw Hats and, you know, the police force down there and everything like that would have been a lot more enjoyable to me than actually seeing them actively escape ahead of time and then just change their faith, like, instantly. That bothered me a little bit, because it's not actually how that goes. Usually, like, if we're comparing it to the real world, trying to change somebody's faith is extremely hard, especially when you're super dedicated to it and scared of your religion like those people were. So I felt like them just kind of, like, believing her after, you know, she just yelled to Eneru that she didn't recognize him as her god, it felt kind of tacky, but I understand why they did it that way. So basically, to end off the story, Luffy rang the bell, everybody heard it, everybody was happy, and Nolan's descendants were happy, and they basically had to find a new dream now, essentially, because they obviously couldn't find the City of Gold down there. They know it's up there now. And then you do have the fact that it did actually end the war between the Skypieans and the Shandorians, which is really great. And then essentially they just kind of like all got along from that point. They had parties and they were all together, and they also realized that their City of Gold was up there, and they're all looking at that. But obviously they realized that the golden bell that fell out of the sky actually, you know, fell kind of like over a cliff, essentially. I felt like that was a little unrealistic as well, because that golden bell was huge. There's no way they would actually be able to pull that up, like physically pull that up. There's just no way. They would need some kind of pulley system or something like that. That felt super unrealistic, but it was heartwarming to see them actually get their bell up. And something I meant to mention as well is Eneru did actually end up escaping after his defeat from Luffy on his ship to go elsewhere, essentially. At this point as well, you do have Nico Robin actually reading the poneglyph to see that Goldie Roger did actually leave a message. That actually threw me for a loop, and that was a nice surprise. It was nice to actually be surprised in this arc, because as you're progressing through this story of Skypiea, you can actually get an idea of where everything's going to go, essentially, who's going to be beaten, and how, you know, basically things are going to end up. I wasn't expecting a message left by Goldie Roger, and that was a nice little surprise. Now, at this point, the Straw Hats are actually ready to leave, and I found it really funny, actually, that they were going to steal gold from them when they didn't have to. They were basically going to get this giant piece of gold that their ship couldn't possibly hold. It couldn't possibly hold that amount of gold and weight. I just don't believe it, essentially. But I guess it's a big ship, so maybe, depending on the weight of it. But anyways, I found it hilarious that they were actually going to rob them and leave like that, and they didn't even have to. They were going to be given so much gold. But I really like that ending, essentially, where they just kind of stole everything and they stayed true to their nature of being pirates, and they were just laughing the whole way. I really like that. Now, some points I did want to highlight as to why I felt like the arc was important. I didn't feel like it wasn't important to the story. I felt like it was just super drawn out, way more than it needed to be. It wasn't super long in itself, but it had me actually not super interested in actively watching it episode to episode base. I would just watch a couple episodes and then just call it quits for like a couple days, essentially. I just wasn't super drawn in the beginning. However, after watching the entire thing and watching the fight versus Luffy and Eneru, even though it was predictable with the outcome, because obviously Eneru was essentially kind of like half of his power was nerfed because it didn't affect Luffy. I like the fact that Luffy kind of like smashed him with the golden ball essentially into the bell. I thought that was really cool, and it showed the significance of Luffy just being true to himself and wanting everybody to hear the bell and, you know, see that Nolan wasn't a liar. I thought that was good. It explored a lot of like faith, and I think it even explored a lot of faith in the Straw Hats themselves. Maybe even Zoro was just kind of like, huh, okay, maybe they're, you know, the idea of God is a little interesting, essentially. He still didn't see Eneru as a god to him, but maybe something changed in Zoro. I don't really know. They didn't discuss that or talk on it anyways. I'm just more so saying, in my point of view, I do feel like all of their versions of faith or their ideas of faith were changed a little bit, or just kind of like they got a different viewpoint, essentially, on the idea of God in this entire arc. And I guess I kind of like that. Another really big thing for them was the fact that they actually got a ton of gold, thus they got a ton of berries to actually have some money and have them well off for a good while, because they took a lot of gold, essentially. And then obviously you do have Nico Robin reading the poneglyph, seeing the message left by Goldie Roger, probably being one of the most important things in that moment, and seeing that, hey, there's more out there, and then you have like this whole Poseidon situation that I'm really curious about. So I do feel like there was a lot of important moments in the actual show. Exploring faith, them getting a bunch of money, Robin seeing the message left by Goldie Rogers, showing that he was there. It was one of the places that he did visit. So to end off this review, I thoroughly enjoyed the ending, but the story build-up in this arc was just so incredibly slow. The pacing in this arc is so slow, and I feel like that's what a lot of people have issues with. And maybe I need to rewatch it, essentially. I read a couple comments on some other reviews saying that like after they watched it a second time, it was a lot more enjoyable. So maybe eventually I'll go back and watch this again, and maybe I'll enjoy it again. I loved Nolan's story. I thought it was very just tragic, but very heartwarming, and I loved how determined Luffy was to actually finish off his story, essentially, and show everybody that the bell was still up there, or the bell was up there, and the City of Gold is up there, ringing it for all of them to hear one more time. Even the moment where Luffy's in the clouds, essentially, you see his outline of like a victory pose. I thought that was really cool as well. Goldie Roger, I'm super curious to see and learn more about him, learn what this Poseidon thing is. I want to see what they spend the money on, whether it's something stupid or something important. So basically, I enjoyed the ending of it and how it all kind of tied together, but I did not love the pacing of the story. Well, guys, that was my Skypiea arc. Well, guys, that was my One Piece Skypiea arc review. Hopefully you did enjoy it. I know this was probably a little bit all over the place. I'm still kind of getting used to doing these kind of reviews on different animes and things like that. It's a little bit outside of my realm of like expertise a little bit in terms of like doing the videos, essentially, I guess. Like, I'm still new to this. I do a lot of like Funko Pop content and things like that on my main channel, so this is definitely a different area of expertise for me, but I am thoroughly enjoying doing these style reviews, and I look forward to actually getting better at doing them. So if you did enjoy this video by some chance, make sure to leave a like down below. I'd really appreciate it. One thing you guys can do as well is make sure to comment down below whether you agreed with some of my points of views or disagreed. Do you guys thoroughly enjoy the Skypiea arc in its entirety? Do you have any issues with it at all? I would love to hear your honest opinions down below. But with that, thank you again so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.